They made American Pickers and became famous together, but somewhere along the way, something went wrong and things got messed up. Most fans never knew that what looked like a close team of pickers on TV was breaking apart behind the camera. There were hidden fights, personal problems, and choices made off camera that almost ruined the show. What really happened behind the scenes of American Pickers? Why did one half of the favorite duo disappear without any warning? And who was really in charge? It was never just about the old stuff. Something deeper was always causing the split. And now we finally know what it was, how American Pickers started. American Pickers, one of the most famous reality shows on TV, started as just a stubborn idea in the mind of Mike Wolfe, a guy who called himself a picker since he was a kid, who had spent years driving across America's back roads, looking through barns, garages, and junkyards searching for forgotten pieces of history. But Mike wasn't just buying old signs, motorcycles, or old toys. To him, each thing had a story and was a piece of America's past waiting to be cleaned off and brought back to life. However, turning that love into a TV show wasn't as easy as he thought. In fact, Wolfe spent 5 long years trying to sell the idea of American Pickers to TV companies and networks, and he was often told that the idea just wasn't good for TV. Networks didn't really understand what the show was about, and bosses had doubts about whether people would want to watch two guys dig through rusty sheds in the middle of nowhere. But Wolfe wouldn't give up. Finally, the History Channel decided to take a chance on him, and on January 18, 2010, American Pickers showed up on TV for the first time. From the very first episode, it was clear that this show wasn't like anything else on TV. It mixed history, treasure hunting, American culture, and human connection all wrapped into one. The show's setup was about two pickers traveling across the country, knocking on doors, meeting interesting people, and finding hidden treasures from the past. The original cast had Mike Wolfe, his longtime friend and picking partner, Frank Fritz and Danielle Colby, who worked behind the scenes at Wolfe's antique shop, Antique Archaeology, based in LeClaire, Iowa. Danielle was like the team's backbone by taking phone calls, managing calls, and helping Wolfe and Fritz find good places to go. Her punk rock energy and deep knowledge of burlesque and old culture added a special edge to the show's feel. But Mike Wolfe's dream wasn't just about buying and selling antiques to make money. It was about teaching viewers about the forgotten pieces of American craftsmanship, celebrating the smartness of old machines, hand-painted signs, one-of-a-kind bikes, and even roadside weird things that had been forgotten. The public right away connected with the idea, and the first episode brought in 1 million viewers, making it the most watched debut for the History Channel since the debut of Ice Road Truckers back then. It didn't take long for the show to become a huge hit. Some episodes, especially those that showed rare finds or emotional backstories, reached up to 5 million viewers, a huge number for cable TV. Part of what people loved was the friendship between Mike Wolfe and Fritz. The two had known each other since high school, and their talking felt real, familiar, and unscripted. While Wolfe often liked vintage motorcycles, rare advertising signs, and mechanical weird things, Fritz liked toys, oil cans, and collectibles. Their different tastes created a balance that gave the show depth, and their occasional arguments added just enough tension to keep things interesting. As their fame grew, so did their brand. Wolfe's Antique Archaeology store became a special place for fans, bringing visitors from across the country. Its rustic, organized style gave the feeling of stepping into a living museum where almost everything on display had a story. To keep up with demand, Wolfe expanded the business and opened a second antique archaeology location in Nashville, Tennessee in 2011. Another thing that made American Pickers stand out was its focus on the human side of collecting. Every stop wasn't just about the items themselves, it was about the people behind them. Whether it was a widow holding onto her late husband's motorcycle, a shy collector finally ready to give up his lifetime collection, or a family looking to clean out a childhood home. The show was as much about feelings and memories as it was about buying and selling. This emotional heart helped the series go beyond typical reality TV. The show told small personal stories based in history, and in doing so it hit a cultural nerve. In fact, the show's success inspired international spin-offs, including Canadian Pickers and Aussie Pickers. While these versions didn't have the same staying power or emotional pull as the American original, their very existence proved the worldwide appeal of the show's format. The idea of treasure hunting in forgotten places connected with people far beyond the United States. By the early 2010s, American Pickers had become a pop culture phenomenon. Wolfe and Fritz appeared on talk shows, gave interviews to major publications, and were recognized as the faces of a growing interest in vintage collecting. Antique shops saw more business. Flea markets reported higher attendance, and the phrase picking entered everyday vocabulary. Wolfe was even credited with bringing back public interest in turning things once considered junk into objects of fascination. But even as it got more popular, American Pickers was quietly building toward a breaking point. Behind the show's emotional appeal, tensions were growing and differences in personalities, creative direction, and unresolved conflicts would eventually change the dynamic that viewers had come to love. And as the fame grew, so did the cracks beneath the surface, and soon those cracks would begin to show. The challenges that changed American Pickers forever. At its peak, American Pickers looked effortless. Two longtime friends on the road finding forgotten treasures, sharing laughs, and trading gentle jokes. But what most viewers didn't see was how much stress existed behind the scenes, especially for one of its most beloved stars. For over 10 years, Frank Fritz had been Mike Wolfe's picking partner and the show's co-lead. His laid-back charm, sarcastic wit, and love for collectibles like vintage toys and oil cans gave the series a unique rhythm. But off-camera, Frank had been quietly fighting a battle that would eventually take him away from the show and from the public eye altogether. Frank was diagnosed with Crohn's disease, a chronic, painful condition of the stomach and intestines. It's a painful, unpredictable illness that often flares up without warning and requires constant watching. For more than 30 years, Frank managed the disease while keeping up with the demands of a heavy filming schedule. However, as the years went on, it became harder to hide just how much it was hurting his body. During seasons 8 and 9, fans began to notice that Frank was missing from multiple episodes. At the time, the show gave little explanation, but in later interviews, Frank revealed that he had taken time off specifically to deal with Crohn's flare-ups. Traveling across the country, sleeping in hotel beds, and going through long filming days were no longer something his body could easily handle. Still, he pushed through, determined not to let the illness define him. However, in 2020, things got more serious when Frank had major back surgery, which required 185 stitches and putting 2 rods into his spine. The recovery was tough, and he disappeared from the show for months, making fans wonder about his future. While Mike Wolfe and the network stayed pretty quiet, Frank would later explain that his health simply wasn't good enough for him to continue filming. Then in July 2022, the unthinkable happened. Frank had a stroke at his Iowa home where a friend found him not responding and called for help. The incident left him with problems making decisions, and a court-appointed guardian was put in place to watch over his medical and money matters. He was no longer able to live by himself and was placed in a rehabilitation center to begin the long road to recovery. But that wasn't the only battle Frank was facing. In a 2021 interview, he opened up about another deeply personal struggle, addiction. Following the physical pain and emotional stress of recovering from surgery, Frank began using illegal drugs as a way to cope. He also struggled with drinking alcohol for a while, but after recognizing the danger, he checked himself into the Abbey Center in Iowa, where he completed a 77-day rehabilitation program. It was a rare moment of openness from someone who had spent so much of his public life joking and smiling on camera, and for many fans, it was heartbreaking. Here was a man who had given so much to American Pickers and had built the show alongside Mike Wolfe from the very beginning. But now he was pushed aside by a combination of medical problems and personal demons. But even as fans supported Frank, there were cracks forming in the show's foundation that couldn't be ignored. One of the most persistent criticisms over the years was that American Pickers had become too scripted. What once felt spontaneous and real now seemed overly polished, predictable, and, according to some critics, fake. Viewers began to notice that the early charm of knocking on strangers' doors had largely disappeared. In the early seasons, Mike and Frank often made it up as they went by driving into unknown towns with no clear plan, taking chances on word-of-mouth leads, and genuinely discovering new locations in real time. It felt like a real road trip, full of uncertainty and excitement. But by the middle seasons, things had changed. Fans noticed that locations seemed pre-approved, conversations more rehearsed, and the element of surprise that made the show compelling was slowly being filtered out. And so, fans accused the show of staging pics, scripting interactions, and editing footage to create fake emotion. Eventually, Mike Wolfe decided to address the criticism head-on. Responding to a fan who insisted the show was staged, he clarified, staged meaning we know where we're going. Yep, true story, scripted, negative. Wolfe admitted that the show had changed because of their growing fame. As the Pickers became more recognizable, it became nearly impossible to just wander into a small town without being noticed. Homeowners now knew who they were and what the show was about, and many began reaching out in advance to offer their collections. The spontaneity of the early days, while not gone, had been scaled back to accommodate the realities of producing a hit TV show. And from a production standpoint, it made sense. After all, you can't run a running series without a certain level of planning. Safety, logistics, permits, and camera crews require coordination. But the very measures that kept the show running smoothly were also the ones that began to drain its soul. For longtime fans, American Pickers didn't feel quite the same anymore. The light-hearted friendship between Mike and Frank had vanished. The show became more about transactions than storytelling, and the increasing focus on Mike Wolfe, who was often picking alone or with rotating guests, left viewers with the sense that something core had been lost. By the time Frank's health issues were made public, it had been months since he last appeared on the show. And though Wolfe eventually posted a statement showing support for his longtime friend after the stroke, many fans felt the damage was already done. The tension between the on-screen friendship and the off-screen reality had become too obvious to ignore. While Wolfe insisted there was no bad blood between them, Frank told a very different story of feeling abandoned, iced out, and left behind after years of loyalty to the show. But Frank's health, personal struggles, and absence weren't the only factors that negatively impacted the show, because what came next wasn't just a shift in casting. It was a shift in tone, direction, and audience trust. How Frank Fritz's exit changed the show forever. The friendship between Mike Wolfe and Frank Fritz was one of its most important features of the show. Their talking felt real, their differences made for good TV, and their friendship gave the show a backbone that couldn't be faked. But when Frank Fritz quietly disappeared from the series in 2020, and then was officially let go in 2021, fans quickly realized something had shifted, and for many of them, the show would never recover. At the time, his absence was left largely unexplained. Viewers guessed, but the network said little. It wasn't until July 2021 that it became official that Frank Fritz would not be returning to American Pickers. Mike Wolfe released a public statement acknowledging Frank's departure, praising him for the work they had done together, but the statement was formal, polished, and oddly distant. It lacked the kind of warmth and loyalty fans expected from someone who had shared the screen with Frank for more than 20 seasons. In later reports, multiple insiders said Frank's personal struggles with addiction was a major factor in the fallout. It was a difficult truth, but not an entirely surprising one. Frank had already gone public about his battles with addiction and his decision to enter rehab. But while Wolfe seemed concerned for his friend, It became clear to the fans that the relationship between the two men had gotten bad long before fans realized. Frank, for his part, didn't hold back. In an explosive interview, he claimed he hadn't spoken to Wolfe in over 2 years, despite everything they had built together, and that silence, especially during the toughest period of Frank's life, was something he never fully understood. In the interview, he said, "I haven't talked to Mike in 2 years. He knew my back was messed up, but he didn't call me up and ask how I was doing. That's just how it is." Worse still, Frank felt not just removed from the show, but replaced and actively pushed aside. In his absence, Mike's brother, Robbie Wolfe, stepped into the co-host role, and while Robbie had made appearances on the show in the past, his promotion to full-time picker felt sudden and unnatural to longtime viewers. The friendship wasn't the same, and the energy between the brothers lacked the familiar tension and friendship that Frank had brought. Frank even went so far as to compare the situation to Steven Tyler and Aerosmith, saying that Wolfe wanted to be the star and to hog the spotlight. In Frank's eyes, American Pickers had become less about the team and more about Mike Wolfe, the brand. And for someone who had helped build that brand from the ground up, it hurt. This feeling wasn't lost on fans. Social media was flooded with comments criticizing Wolfe and the show's producers for how Frank's exit was handled. Many viewers expressed disappointment not only at the lack of honesty, but at what felt like a cold and calculated decision to move forward without acknowledging what Frank had meant to the show. The silence during his back surgery, his rehab stint, and later his stroke was especially damning in the eyes of many loyal fans. And that's where the damage really began, because while American Pickers technically continued, something had fundamentally shifted. Without Frank, the show's energy had changed, the tone became more quiet, the pacing felt different, and the humor, which was once a hallmark of the Mike and Frank dynamic, faded into the background. Of course, the ratings reflected this change. While American Pickers still pulled respectable numbers, viewer engagement dropped, and the once die-hard fan base became increasingly split. Forums and comment sections were filled with nostalgia for the earlier seasons, with some fans outright refusing to watch the show without Frank in it. For many, it wasn't about the antiques. It was about the friendship between the co-stars. And once that disappeared, so did the magic. Despite all the public tension, the story didn't end with bitterness. In July 2022, when Frank suffered a serious stroke, it marked a turning point not just in his health, but in his relationship with Mike. According to reports, Wolfe was one of the first people to reach out and visit. Though the details were kept private, sources close to the show confirmed that the two made up during Frank's recovery, and that Wolfe remained supportive during what would become some of Frank's most vulnerable days. It was an act of closure that offered some comfort to fans who had felt the emotional whiplash of their sudden fallout, but it also served as a painful reminder that the bond they shared was real, even if it couldn't survive the pressures of television fame. To this day, many fans still see Frank's departure as the moment the show lost its soul, not because the antiques weren't still interesting or the locations weren't still rich with history, but because the heart, the humor, and the human connection that Frank brought could never truly be replaced. But Frank wasn't the only one whose absence reshaped the show. As fans kept watching, they noticed someone else slowly fading from view, and her silence spoke volumes: Danielle Colby's reduced role. For over 10 years, Danielle Colby was the steady presence behind the scenes of American Pickers. While Mike and Frank hit the road in search of hidden treasures, Danielle was the one working the phones, tracking down leads, managing the day at Antique Archaeology, and keeping the business running. Her edgy style, love for vintage culture, and deep knowledge of collectibles brought a distinct voice to the show that fans instantly connected with. But following Frank Fritz's exit in 2021, viewers began to notice another subtle change. Danielle's screen time began to drop. Although she hadn't left the show, her appearances became less frequent and more limited in scope. Longtime fans took to social media to ask where she had gone. Was she phased out of the show, or was she distancing herself from the show's new direction? The rumors gained traction, but Mike Wolfe quickly addressed the speculation, confirming that Danielle was still very much a part of the team. He explained that as the show evolved, production focused more heavily on the road trips and item pickups, segments where Danielle had never been a regular presence. Still, the noticeable dip in her involvement felt symbolic. In a time when the show was losing key figures, Danielle's diminished role made it feel even more unstable. Her reduced presence left a void not just in logistics, but in tone. Danielle had been the balance in the third voice who grounded Mike and Frank, added context to the picks, and offered a different perspective from behind the desk. Without her full participation, the show felt increasingly like a one-man operation and a stark contrast to the ensemble chemistry that once defined it. To many fans, Danielle represented the last link to the show's golden era. And though she remains part of the American Pickers family, her reduced role further confirmed that the show they fell in love with was slipping away. But the problems didn't end there, and some fans of American Pickers had an issue with the person who stepped in to fill Frank Fritz's shoes. Robbie Wolfe's takeover. In the wake of Frank Fritz's departure, American Pickers faced a tough question: who would fill his shoes? It was then that the network decided to bring in Robbie Wolfe, Mike's younger brother. Robbie had appeared here and there throughout the series, usually in minor roles or during special episodes. He was familiar to fans, but never meant to be a central figure. However, after Frank's departure, Robbie began going with Mike full-time on picking trips, effectively stepping into the co-host role Frank had occupied for over 10 years. But the network didn't realize just how much backlash this decision would spark. While Robbie certainly had the family connection, viewers felt he lacked the dynamic presence Frank had brought to the show. Frank's humor, passion for oddball collectibles, and genuine friendship with Mike had been years in the making. In contrast, Robbie's on-screen style came across as stiff, business-like, and in the eyes of many fans, forced. Social media lit up with comparisons. Viewers complained that Robbie and Mike had no chemistry and that the show had lost its heart. The easy, sometimes grumpy friendship between Mike and Frank had been replaced with what felt like a rehearsed partnership. Robbie was capable, but when it comes to TV, charisma isn't something you can manufacture. And unfortunately, many fans simply didn't connect with him. Beyond the criticism, the numbers told a similar story. After Frank's departure and Robbie's promotion, the show suffered a decline in ratings. While American Pickers had once pulled in millions of viewers per episode, the newer seasons began to dip below expectations. Enthusiasm waned, and even loyal fans admitted they were tuning in less frequently, or not at all. This ratings slump came despite the fact that Mike Wolfe had signed a 3-year contract extension with the History Channel. The deal was a sign of the network's continued commitment to the show, but it also revealed the pressure Wolfe was under to carry the brand on his own. Without Frank as his foil and Danielle in a reduced role, the responsibility to keep the show engaging fell squarely on Mike's shoulders, and unfortunately, Robbie's addition wasn't enough to fill the gap. Critics even argued that Robbie's presence only highlighted just how irreplaceable Frank had been. What was once a trio of friends chasing stories on the back roads of America had become something more streamlined, more polished, and for many viewers, far less authentic. With ratings slipping and old wounds still fresh, one big question remains: what's next for American Pickers? What's next for American Pickers? Right now, American Pickers stands at a crossroads both as a television series and as a cultural institution. Having aired over 400 episodes since its premiere in 2010, the show has become one of the most enduring, unscripted programs in History Channel's lineup. But after more than 10 years of chasing rusted treasures across back roads and barns, change is finally catching up with the franchise. The network recently renewed the show for a new season, reassuring longtime viewers that there's still more to come. But with that announcement came another. After the upcoming season airs, American Pickers might be going on a break. While it hasn't been canceled, the pause signals a period of reflection for the series. The producers are stepping back to consider how, or even, if the show can change in a way that remains relevant and compelling in a post-Frank Fritz era. Despite the behind-the-scenes controversies, shifting cast dynamics, and critical fan response over the past few years, American Pickers continues to hold a unique place in the hearts of antique lovers and nostalgia seekers. Its premise remains simple but powerful, and for many viewers, the show isn't just about old signs or motorcycles. It's about history, storytelling, and the beauty of overlooked things. That emotional core has always been anchored by Mike Wolfe, who remains both the face of the franchise and the steady hand behind the scenes. He continues to run his antique business, Antique Archaeology. However, in April 2025, he announced his decision to close up their Nashville antique shop. But even outside of the show, Wolfe remains a vocal advocate for preservation and vintage craftsmanship. His social media presence, personal projects, and public appearances are proof of his commitment to the values that American Pickers was built on. But 2024 brought a moment that shook both the show's cast and its devoted fan base. On September 30th, 2024, Frank Fritz, Mike's original picking partner and co-star, passed away at the age of 60. The cause was complications related to the stroke he had suffered in 2022, which had already left him under guardianship and in need of round-the-clock care. Though Frank had been absent from the show for several seasons, his death marked the end of an era. For many fans, it felt deeply personal. Frank wasn't just a character on TV. He was the heart of the early seasons, bringing warmth, humor, and a deep curiosity for forgotten relics. His bond with Mike, though strained in later years, was the backbone of the show's success. In the wake of Frank's passing, Mike Wolfe posted a heartfelt tribute to his longtime friend. In a statement shared across platforms, Wolfe acknowledged the complicated relationship they'd had in recent years, but chose to focus on their shared history. Danielle Colby, another original cast member and close friend of Frank's, also paid her respects online. She shared old photos of their early days at Antique Archaeology and wrote about the impact Frank had not only on the show, but also on the people around him. So, what's next for American Pickers? At the moment, the future is uncertain. There are talks of exploring new formats for the show. However, whether or not the show continues in its current form, its place in television history is secure. It changed how people think about antiques. It turned two friends into household names, and it proved that even the rustiest, dustiest piece of scrap could carry a story worth hearing. Would you like to see American Pickers return for more seasons? Drop your answers in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen.